Namaste, Vanakkam, hello. We're going to address the question that many Hindus have, how to deal with evangelization. Now, before we address the specific topic of Christianity, let's first say a few things about religion in general. You see, it is often said in India that all religions essentially say the same thing. And to some extent, they do say the same thing. As the French sociologist Émile Durkheim said, the one thing in common of all religions is the awe for the sacred. That is a definition of religion that is absolutely essential to religion. The awe of the sacred, the separation between the profane and the sacred. As a sociologist, he added that this served to create a unity in a population. Let's leave that out for now. It is at any rate the awe for the sacred. And so this element of religiosity you will always find in every doctrine that calls itself a religion. For example, when Moses in the Bible receives a revelation in the burning bush, where someone appears to him who is going to, a voice essentially, who is going to introduce himself as Yahweh, then he hears the voice, "Take off your shoes, because this is holy ground." Now, very many Hindus who read that will have a feeling of recognition. Why should he take off his shoes? Because it's holy ground, because there's a manifestation of the divine going on there. Today in churches, people don't take off their shoes. They go in with their shoes on, unlike in Hindu temples. So you could say, well, you see, there's an element here in the Bible that also exists in Hinduism. See that they are the same religion. No, but they are the same at that fundamental level of awe for the sacred. And so that is in common. They treat the sacred as the sacred. When you hear about some place in Arabia or so, where a pupil is punished because he has thrown the holy book into the dustbin, there is nothing particularly fundamentalist or fanatical or so about it. It's just awe for the sacred. That book, which you and I may not find sacred, but that particular population finds it sacred, and therefore they treat it with respect. They will not countenance throwing the book into the dustbin or even just on the floor. They treat it as a sacred object. And so about that, there's nothing fundamentalist, there's nothing what Hindus call Abrahamic. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's something that you will find in Hinduism, in Islam, in Christianity, everywhere. So that is a fundamental level of religiosity that you find in all religions. But Christianity is a bit more than that. The Ten Commandments, here we are still in the Old Testament, that is to say the Jewish Bible, which came about before there was Christ or Christianity, but which has been taken over into Christianity. You have a famous passage called the Ten Commandments. Now the Ten Commandments fall apart in two parts. The second one is an age-old morality, where it says that you shall not, or rather, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and so on. So you are enjoined to do a number of things about which very few people would disagree. You should respect your parents, you should respect property, you should respect chastity. Those are fairly common commandments. God did not need to do any revelation on the Mount Sinai, to give those, because people already knew them. Those were the normal common rules of morality. They were therefore treated with great respect, but not with surprise. They were just very common. They already existed since generations before that. But the second part is a new theology, which says that there's only one God, you should worship only one God. Rather, originally it says you should worship only one God. The interpretation that there was no other God came only later. But so you should worship only one God, and you should not worship images, whether images of all the other gods, deemed false or deemed lower or deemed evil, or even images of the one true God. You should not make images of God himself, because that also detracts from his fullness. So that's a new theology, and that was indeed surprising, and that was resented, and many people rejected it. But so that became the hallmark, the distinctive trait of this new religion, which was Judaism. Within this Jewish religion, in specific circumstances, centuries later, arose a new idea, namely that of the Messiah, which also became another typical trait of Judaism. The belief in the Messiah, that is to say, an anointed king who would come back and restore the kingdom of that particular people that worship this religion, namely the Israelites. This was not a necessity. They might have had their kingdom forever, but you see, when they lost it, they started yearning for someone who would come to restore this kingdom. That was going to be the anointed one, the Messiah, or in Greek translation, the Christ. And then a few centuries later, somebody was born by the name of Jesus, probably, though we don't have very reliable historical data about that. But let's call him Jesus. And he started a career as a wandering healer and exorcist. We should not think too highly about the type of medicine he practiced. It was typically primitive medicine, where diseases are ascribed to evil spirits. And so the business of Jesus was to drive out these spirits. Then he apparently at some point got it into his head that he was not just special, working special cures, but that he was very special and that he was the Messiah. So he attracted this relatively new doctrine of the Messiah to himself. Then, because of this or because of another reason, he got executed by the Roman occupying force. Perhaps, according to the story, with the approval of the Jewish hierarchy and the Jewish population. We don't know that for sure. But at any rate, he disappeared. And then, according to Christians, 2 days later, he got resurrected. He was brought back to life. So here, finally, something special happens. So far, a wandering healer, in those days, they were 10 a penny. People who thought something very big of themselves, they too are fairly common. But people who rise from the dead, now that is more special. Did Jesus do this? There is no indication of that, because he disappeared like most people who die. You see, typical for dead people is that you can't meet them anymore. Living people are perhaps too important to meet somebody unimportant like us, but if we try very, very hard, we can meet them. Whereas people who died, well. So, according to the belief that Jesus was resurrected, he should still be among us. Now, the writers of the gospel found a solution to that. Namely, they spirited him away through the ascension so that he rose straight up to heaven. But his disciples started to cultivate the story that he hadn't really died, that indeed he had gone to heaven, but that meanwhile he had pulled off a very special trick, namely to conquer death. This was moreover invested with a very special meaning, namely that thereby he had conquered human sinfulness. Indeed, Christians believe that mankind started with a fall, a lapse into sin. Soon after being created in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve committed the first sin. And because of this sin, they acquired mortality. Until then, they were like the angels or like other eternal creatures. But then, when they became sinful, they lapsed into mortality. That is why it is the victory over death, the victory over mortality, that puts an end to this sinfulness. And that's where Jesus comes in. So he has liberated us all from sin. Now here again, if you trust the testimony of your own eyes, you wouldn't notice that, because the amount of sinfulness in the world has not appreciably diminished after Jesus' supposed resurrection. You see, the world has gone on without noticing that in this far corner of Palestine something momentous had happened. And so this is a very hard point to believe, but in Christianity that is the whole point. You have to believe. You know, even if you haven't seen it, even if your brain calls it an absurdity, you still have to believe it. So it's a matter of belief, it's an item of belief. Since then, we have come to associate the word religion with some strange, irrational belief. And so if Christians want to know about your religion, as for example a Hindu, they will ask the strange question, yeah, but what do you believe? And so Hindus who don't really know what this is all about, they say, oh yeah, we believe in reincarnation. Well, maybe, you know, many Hindus do. There is no law that says that you have to believe in reincarnation to be a Hindu, but yes, the belief has become quite widespread. Nevertheless, it has a different status from Christian belief. You see, in Christianity you have this irrational belief that is at the core of their religion. As St. Paul says, if there was no resurrection, my faith would be in vain. The absolutely defining point of Christianity is the belief in the resurrection. That is also why others, like Jews and like Muslims, dissent from Christianity, disagree with Christianity, find this a bit of an absurdity, like in the Quran, where Jesus is accepted as a special figure, as a prophet. He is nonetheless believed not to have died on the cross. If he survived afterwards, it is that he never died, but it's not that he came back from the dead. And in that respect, at least, we would have to call Islam relatively rational. You see, most religions are very good at finding fault with the other religions, with their rivals. On that you can usually trust them. It's only when they talk about their own claims that they lose a bit of rationality. So, here we have the basic beliefs of Christianity. An extra one that is also interesting is the belief in the virgin birth. The fact that Jesus, this wandering healer who was later resurrected, that he was born from a virgin. Now that is again another important item of belief, less central but still quite common. Now those are the beliefs that set Christianity apart. There still are many things in common. I return to my first point. You see, in Christianity, as in other religions, you have a big layer of religiosity that is in common. For example, Christians practice Lent, that is to say fasting, at the end of winter, beginning of spring, for 6 weeks. Now this practice of fasting in all kinds of variations exists in most religions. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not because it is Christian that there would be anything wrong or un-Hindu or mlecha or so about it. You see, this fasting is a healthy practice, is a sane practice. But yes, it was indeed adopted by Christianity. Prayer, for example, is also a very common element in religion. The fact of addressing a higher power. And I still speak in general of a higher power. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, like in Christianity. But so this phenomenon of prayer, of fasting, of pilgrimage, for example, are widespread. Though the case of pilgrimage is a bit special. You see, if you go on pilgrimage, it means that you're going on a god who lives in a particular place. You see, that's how it exists in Hinduism. You are going to the Kedarnath, for example, the lingam of Kedarnath, or you are going to Ayappa in Sabarimala or so. If you want to be in the presence of that god, you have to go all the way on pilgrimage. Now, that's typically pagan. And so in a monotheist religion that believes in only one God who is omnipresent, this, strictly speaking, doesn't have a place. Strictly speaking, you don't have to go to Santiago de Compostela, an important Christian place of pilgrimage, or to Jerusalem, or to Rome, because God is everywhere. Not only in the place where his supposed son lived and died and was resurrected, but or other saints, you see, where they had their career. This is all not important because God is everywhere. All your life you can be locked up in a cell or something. Doesn't matter. You see, as far as your relation with God is concerned, he's there all the time. So that's already a bit of a difference between Christianity and other religions. And so gradually Christianity has carved out its own niche with a few basic doctrines that set it completely apart from other religions, and then some lesser beliefs that have grown up around it. So when Jesus was gone, his 12 apostles remained behind, and they were so fired up with zeal for the new religion that they wanted to export it to wherever they went. This is all following the commandment of Jesus, who says, "Go and teach all nations." Some Hindus in particular who think they know all better than Christians about the Christians' own religion say that there is really no support in the teachings of Jesus for the missionary project. And they say, oh, no, the real Jesus would have opposed the missions. And that is nonsense. It is Jesus himself who explicitly gave a commandment that you have to go and teach all nations, that you have to bring Christianity everywhere. So some of the apostles took this very seriously. The apostle Thomas set up a church in Syria, and from there he moved farther away from the Holy Land, and he went to India, at least. That's what the Acts of the St. Thomas say. The Acts of Thomas is an apocryphal and not really official and not church-approved text from a century after the life of St. Thomas says about him. It says that he went to India. Now, India is a very large concept. It can often mean Asia as a whole, or it meant somewhere vague, somewhere behind Iran, behind Persia, and then they didn't know exactly anymore. But the book says a bit more. It explains where he ends up, namely in a kingdom that is a bit desert-like. It's not at all like the lush vegetation of Kerala, where Indian Christians try to situate him, where people have Persian names. So it is probable that this is Afghanistan or the Northwest province at most. Doesn't come closer to the India that we now know. There he made himself impossible. He did some supposed miracles, but he also locked people up. He killed people or had people killed. And the king who had given him hospitality had his doubts and said, you see, we don't want you here anymore. You are creating too much trouble. But he insisted, and he insisted on continuing his trouble, and so finally he was executed. This was not because of his faith, this was not Christianity being persecuted or so. This was simply because of his own antisocial behavior. According to the book, of course, we don't know what really is true in all this. But at any rate, there is no mention of India there at all. Then, by the 4th century, we know of Christians in India. This was a time when Christianity started to become frowned upon in the Persian Empire, which was the rival of the Roman Empire. Christianity by then had become the state religion of Rome, and so it became a hostile presence in Persia. And so, feeling the heat in Persia, a certain Thomas Canonius took his community to live in a hospital country, namely India. Because he was called Thomas, he was probably confused with the Saint Thomas. Probably because, again, you see, this is long ago. Texts about those episodes are very few. We don't know for sure. But at any rate, for all we know, after St. Thomas, 3 centuries after, or maybe even during his lifetime, some Christians came from Palestine or from Syria all the way to India and settled there, were given hospitality there by the Hindus. You imagine that a Christian country in those days when Christianity was still taken seriously gave hospitality to foreigners with a foreign religion. That never happened, but Hindus had no problem with it. They had already given hospitality to the Jews. Now the Christians, later on the Parsis, the Tibetans, the Armenians. So Hindus are used to hospitality. And in fact, hospitality is in many cases the normal human behavior. It's only Christianity that created a problem of whether you are inside their religion or outside. Anyway, so the community of Thomas worshipping St. Thomas, or venerating St. Thomas, strictly speaking, in Christianity you're not supposed to worship anyone except God and his incarnation, Jesus. But you venerate this saint, and so that way, through his venerators, St. Thomas did acquire a place in Kerala. Later on, Christians started cultivating the story that St. Thomas had lived there and had also died there. They claimed, or they started claiming, that St. Thomas had died in what is now Chennai, and that he had been killed by Brahmins. The original text of the Acts of St. Thomas says that he was killed b'ruhme, which is by spear, with a spear. But the vowels are the same as in Brahma, and so for the needs of the case here in India, it has been reinterpreted that he was killed by Brahmins. This is a real case of blood libel. The people who gave hospitality to the Christian community then got accused of murdering their saint. So this whole story of St. Thomas in India is a bit murky, is tainted by slander, by false accusations, and is probably not true anyway. There was no St. Thomas in South India. But in today's India, this is an unassailable story. Even secularist politicians, whenever they say anything about Christians, find it necessary to repeat this story to once more bring St. Thomas to India, and even to add that it is Brahmins who killed him. By contrast, Pope Benedict XVI, the last but one pope, he said explicitly that St. Thomas came to what he calls North India, meaning Iranian-speaking parts of the Northwest or Afghanistan, and that from there on, Christianity, not the saint, but his followers, reached South India later. Now that's a far more realistic scenario. And so we can forget about St. Thomas here in India. The presence of Christianity in India has, however, less to do with this St. Thomas community that has thrived in India on the coast of Kerala for, in the worst case, or in the strongest case at least, almost 20th centuries. But they are not the ones who brought Christianity in India, who brought you people the problem of evangelism. As you know, the Portuguese landed in India in 1194, if I'm not mistaken, and they started a very aggressive missionary movement. It is they also who propagated on a war footing the story of St. Thomas's martyrdom. And indeed, a cathedral was built in forcible replacement of a Shiva temple on the place where he was supposedly martyred. Initially, the Portuguese tried to convert the upper strata of Hindu society, but when that didn't go so well, they discovered the lower strata. Not that the church and the Christians in Europe at that time had any problem with the phenomenon of inequality in Indian society. Inequality existed in European society just as well. And indeed in 1623, the Pope gave his blessings to the observation of caste separation within Indian churches. You could have churches where there was a curtain between the part for the higher castes and part for the lower castes, or they'd have two separate entrance doors. And so that was not really an issue, because in Europe too you had a difference between nobility and commoners, and among the commoners between the rich and the poor. This is a relatively natural phenomenon. It's not Christian nor anti-Christian, but it's just there. And it's therefore also not Hindu or non-Hindu. It's in India also just there. Then after the Portuguese came the British with various strands of Protestantism, now mostly replaced by American churches, the Baptist Church, for example. But ultimately, all the Protestant churches from America are present in India. Recently, I was in a car from Thiruvananthapuram to Coimbatore, and along the street I saw like all the bizarre fringe Protestant churches that exist in America, also establishing a presence in India. But so very broadly, you can make a distinction in India between the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches. There are a few differences between them that you had better know. These days, Catholics are relatively moderate in their approach. They are not going to talk about the devil and the fact that you are idol worshippers, that you're bound for hell and so on. These sharp edges are a bit avoided. You see, whereas Protestant churches will be very explicit. They will, for example, insist that if somebody converts to their church, he has to break all ties with his family. He should no longer participate in any of the festivals because they have a tinge of idolatry in them. You see, in the case of Christianity, are now more staid. They used to be more radical, but that is over for them. Whereas some of these Protestant churches can still be very radical and very hard on Hindus, very explicit in their condemnations. In the case of the Catholic Church nowadays, and some of the Protestant churches, they will more emphasize more modern-looking issues like social inequality. But so that's only a selling point, that's only an addition. Basically, what they object to is that you don't believe in Jesus, is that you are an idolater, and therefore you are bound for hell. And some modern Christians say, ha 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 ha, we don't believe this anymore. You know, how can you sell this kind of medieval stuff to modern people? Well, the official church position on this has not changed at all. And so there are indeed many Christians who try to make a compromise with the modern worldview, but to the extent that they call themselves Christians, they still subscribe to this teaching, to this strict separation between pagans and Christians. A separation that goes on after death. Very broadly, another difference between Catholics and Protestants is that nowadays Protestants are going to emphasize the differences with Hinduism, whereas Catholics are going to emphasize the similarities. A very important one is the Virgin Mary, who is venerated by Catholics, not by Protestants. Now that rings a bell among Hindus. That's a very important point of similarity with all the village goddesses, with Durga and Saraswati and so on. And so to appeal to the common people, leaving aside a bit the theological distinctions, this cult of the Virgin Mary is very important in attracting Hindus and in making them feel at home in Catholicism. Protestantism, by contrast, will rather emphasize the differences, will emphasize where Hinduism is bad and evil, or where it is ignorant and superstitious, and will, more than Catholicism, but that is not essentially different, but more emphatically also bring in modern Western and particularly American culture, and to profit from that, to use the prestige of Western culture in order to sell Christianity. For example, I heard it in the Northeast, where they practice some shamanic medicine, which Westerners call primitive, and where they also get an influx of modern hospitals at the same time as they get the missionary message. And so they tend to associate the two, and they call modern medicine Jesus medicine. Whereas in reality, the historical Jesus practiced precisely this primitive medicine, this shamanic medicine, driving out spirits, which had nothing to do with modern medicine. But so they use the prestige of the West that achieves all kinds of things that are unknown or totally new in those villages. And that is, of course, a technique that is well practiced, that to some extent was already used in the time of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had certain technological achievements, which the Germans, the Slavs, and so on had not. And so they used the innovations that were coming in from the Roman Empire in technology to improve the image of Christianity that was coming in at the same time. But this is still being done by Catholics and emphatically by Protestants. There is also, in the case of Protestants, far more foreign culture being brought in, playing guitar and so on, using English for teaching rather than the native languages. Whereas among Catholics there is far more compromise with the national soul, let's call it. Among Catholics too, you also have more genuine patriotism, whereas you have several separatist movements among tribes or nations that have become Protestant. Now, to terminate, let's talk about the enemy image that defiant, proud, patriotic Hindus have vis-à-vis Christianity. Well, first of all, here again, as in so many cases, nationalism is a misstatement of Hindu concerns. You cannot blame Christianity for being foreign, though it is, of course. Christianity was imported, even if it was in 51, in the 1st century, even if it was by St. Thomas, it is still foreign, but that is not so very important. I mean, if it is true, then we should all accept it. We all use the light bulb. Well, the light bulb works no matter where it came from. So that is not really an argument, the fact that it is foreign, though it is. Ultimately, what is wrong with Christianity is not so much what it does. You see, there are all kinds of social work being done, education, medical, by churches, mainly as an argument to sell their ware to populations that have a need of these services. And there's nothing wrong with those services. You see, the Hindu nationalist movement, RSS, also offers such kind of services. And indeed, all the way in Palestine, Hamas, the radically Islamic movement, has equally found its place among the population by offering social services. So there's nothing wrong with those services as such. Unfortunately, they are attached to a message with which something is wrong. So with Christianity, what is wrong is not so much the services they offer, it is the message they are trying to sell. It is simply not true that Jesus died on the cross. It is even less true, or that might be true, it's probably not true. According to Muslims, it is not true. But it is certainly not true that he got resurrected, that he came back from the dead. Is that bad? Well, you don't die from believing such a thing. You can perfectly live all while believing such a thing. Most people in the Middle Ages did it. They took the death and resurrection of Jesus quite seriously. And still they led productive lives, and sometimes they even did scientific inventions, created progress, all while entertaining this pretty simple superstition. So the problem with Christianity is not what it does bad, not even what it did in the colonial period, when the colonizers, the Portuguese and the British, were closely wedded to the church. You see, yes, they did that wrong, but they have an answer to that. Namely that all people are sinners, and that even the church is somewhat tainted by the human tendency to sin. And so they simply apologize. They simply say, okay, we were a part of the problem, now we are going to be part of the solution. So they don't care. They immediately say, okay, sorry, in the worst case, like what the Pope did to the Jews. He said, okay, we are remorseful about what we did, and now we turn the page. In India, they don't even say sorry, they don't even apologize, but nevertheless, they assume that they've turned the page. So you can't catch them on that. To say, oh yeah, the church is racist, it is something from the West, is also not true anymore. More and more, the missionaries in India are natives or are other Asians. And so even if the command center is still somewhere in the West, increasingly the local leaders are indeed locals. And at the same time, Indian Christians are rising through the ranks of the church, of the Jesuit order, and so on. So more and more, this command center is going to be manned by Indians. So here again, you cannot bring in the issue that they are foreign. They are mostly not. You see, the only thing wrong with Christianity is that it's a mistake. And that's something that everybody can understand. It's a mistake. That's why very many people in the West have left the church. What is typically Hindu, on top of that, is that by running after this mistaken belief, they are neglecting the genuine traits of religion. You see, the forms of Hindu devotion, the ways that Hindus take the sacred into their lives, take it seriously, cultivate it, that is all being neglected by Christianity. And so that is a good reason to leave out Christianity. Not the fact that they do anything wrong, that they buy Christians, for example, that they offer their services in return for your soul. You see, that's all very, that's up for criticism, but that's not really what the problem is. Of all those little mistakes, those little sins in Christian terms. An explanation can be found and it can be waved off. But the basic thing about Christianity is a mistaken belief. And so, again, you won't die from it, but you had better do without it. Even the conservative argument, people who have been born in Christianity, who are used to Christianity, let them have their Christian belief. Well, maybe so, but that is not the situation in India. Why do they have to sell their belief? Why do they have other people drop their customs, drop their family life in order to embrace this new but mistaken belief? So Hindus can just do without Christianity. That's the main argument against Christianity. Don't go through all this trouble. Stay with the cult of the sacred that you already have, that you have perfected and sophisticated. That is reason enough for Hindus to go without Christianity. Thank you.